You're listening to SYN 90.7, and it's the second show of Above the Octagon. And what a matchup between Donald Cowboy Cerrone and Jorge Masvidal. Coming into this fight, not a lot of people rated Jorge Masvidal as a chance against Donald Cerrone. Jorge Masvidal was ranked 12th. He was ranked outside the top 10, and yet Donald Cerrone, a top 5 contender in the welterweight division, coming from lightweight, faced him. And the prime reason was that it was in his hometown of Denver. There was no other reason why he would fight. Donald Cerrone came off an absolute war against Matt Brown. He got knocked down and he won a very close fight, and it was via a head kick. But aside from that, Donald Cerrone was also knocked down. But Jorge Masvidal presented a different challenge than Matt Brown did to Cerrone. Jorge Masvidal, came from the streets. He has a mindset of gold, a mindset of steel, and the mind games didn't really play a factor. I mean, Jorge put on a clean striking clinic. He basically had the fight finished in the first round before finishing Cerrone in the second. And it showed in what was a dominant performance from round 1 to round 2. It was quite contentious because you could argue that the fight could have been stopped in the first round when Jorge Masvidal knocked out Cerrone. But the referee didn't stop it. Cerrone has a warrior mentality where he doesn't give up. He waits till the referee stops it. And the thing about this is that sometimes you have to protect the fighter from themselves. Cerrone is just someone who will fight anyone at any time, anywhere. You can only say that to few people, but Cerrone is one of them. And Masvidal definitely showed that vulnerability. As much as it is a strength of the mind, it's a vulnerability physically, because you're coming off 6 weeks off a war against Mac Brown, coming straight into the octagon, which shows no remorse, and Masvidal cleanly put away Donald Cerrone. Not a lot of people rated Masvidal, but the experts coming in knew how much of a challenge Masvidal was, and he should be ranked inside the top 10 now in welterweight, beating Cerrone. Should Cerrone be less of an active fighter, or should he keep up his personality of fighting anywhere, anyone, anytime? The UFC should treat him like a thoroughbred. So by that, I mean they should introduce him to fights, say 3 times a year rather than 2-3 times a year rather than 5 times a year, 4 times a year, because it just puts such a stress on your body. Not the matches themselves, because you only have about 3-4 fights, if that. Sometimes fighters only have 1 or 2. It's the fight camps. Fight camps go on for over 8 weeks. Your body is drained. It's almost a relief when you get inside the octagon, because you go in and all the training is done. This is something that Donald Cerrone will have to consider going forward. There's no doubt he has the mindset. There's no doubt he has the talent. He's got some of the best kicks in the welterweight division, if not the best. So he's extremely talented. But maybe it's time for his coach, Greg Jackson, to pull him aside and say, hey, we've got to restrain you from yourself. But aside from that, Masvidal put on a clinic, and he looks like a bright prospect in the welterweight division. He's only in his young 30s, which is, in UFC terms, is still young. You see Mark Hunt competing, and he's 40 years old, over 40 years old. It's Mark Hunt versus Alistair Overeem. So this is set for UFC 209 in March, and this looks like a phenomenal fight. Alistair is coming off a loss to Stipe Miocic, which was for the heavyweight title in Cleveland, and Hunt's last fight was against Brock Lesnar, which was a loss originally, since overturned to a no contest. Brock Lesnar tested positive for a drug enhancement, and this affected the outcome of the fight. Even though Brock beat Mark Hunt, the fight was overturned to a no contest, and that's a good thing by the Nevada State Athletic Commission, because you don't want fighters coming in there with an unfair advantage, whether they knowingly or unknowingly took a substance that enhanced their performance. But enhancement is a very subjective term, because there's a lot of enhancing substances which enhance your performance that are not illegal to use. So, everyone takes, even the general population, an ibuprofen, Panadol. I mean, these are within the realms of legality, so to speak. Whereas steroids, erythropoietin, which was a classic one, the Lance Armstrong Tour de France Circuit used to increase their oxygen around the muscles, obviously competing in a long-distance cycling race. These are drugs which can also be used in the UFC because it's so grueling. You think 3-5 rounds, you're used to boxing the 12 rounds, but the UFC, you're not only boxing, you're kicking, wrestling, you're doing jiu-jitsu on the mat. There's a lot of things that you're doing which the opponent has to get used to. And Joe Rogan put this well, actually, recently. Joe Rogan's obviously a respected commentator in the UFC. He said that it's almost a game of problem solving. So if you come in there with a set game plan, you don't necessarily need a plan B, plan C, plan D. You need to adapt. And so adaptation is going to be a key factor in the Mark Hunt and Alistair Overeem fight. Both are Grand Prix champions in the K1 there, in the K1 tournament. So they both have incredible striking credentials. But if it goes to the ground, who's going to win that? Mark Hunt's obviously a big, heavy guy, a big, strong guy, an athlete who competes out of Australia with Samoan descent. And Alistair competes from Holland. Both are very strong. Mark Hunt, there was a lot of negotiations to prepare for this fight. Mark Hunt wanted in the contract that if Alistair tested positive, he would be the benefactor of that. He would get the money. But that didn't work out in the Brock Lesnar situation. There's a lawsuit going on at the moment. So it's up to Brock Lesnar to focus on, Mark Hunt, on what, he can control. And that's the ultimate thing in this matchup. There's a time where a fighter needs to say enough is enough. And do you think this is Ronda Rousey's time to say that?
Well, there's two things to consider as well. I mean, you've got the record of the fighter and also the age of the fighter. And how old's Ronda? Is she...
She's in her early 30s.
Early 30s, okay. So that's telling me straight off that it is getting to the end of her run. And I think the fact that someone, if they've lost 2 fights in a row, and the second fight, 48 seconds, that is a very, very short time for them to be knocked out. And I think they're in a situation where they're just going to keep losing because the other fighters are progressing in their skills and she's not keeping up. And I think once you get to that point in your career, it's time to hang up the gloves, basically. Because if you can't put up a reasonable fight, pun not intended, against the other fighters, then it's not. You're wasting your time and you're injuring yourself, or you're going to get injured if you continue. So yeah, I think it's time for her to retire. I think she's done.
There's a constant evolution of fighting, which you just mentioned, where when you're the best, the people up and coming see you as the benchmark and they want to surpass you. And even when you are the best, which was Ronda Rousey's case for a number of years, you have to constantly innovate your fight game. And her biggest weakness in these last 2 fights has been her lack of striking power. She's very good at wrestling. She could definitely challenge a lot of men in the male side just with her wrestling alone. But when it came to striking, she was found out by 2 very good strikers, mind you. Holly Holm, who obviously has massive boxing credentials and kickboxing credentials, and Amanda Nunes. And they say Amanda Nunes hits like a truck. And you kind of saw the effects of when Ronda Rousey was hit.
Yes. Yeah.
And there's also some rumours that have been released just now, as a matter of fact, which is a bit surprising, that when Ronda Rousey is training, she never allowed her opponents to punch her or touch her, because when you get punched, it's not a nice feeling to anyone who has ever got punched before, whether it's, boxing or whatever. And Brock Lesnar, in a similar vein, never liked to get punched. I mean, he was an animal and he never liked to get punched. He just didn't want to. And, would that affect the outcome of the fight, not training to prepare for a punch?
Well, definitely. I mean, one of those things where it's conditioning the body to take those hits. And if you're not doing that, if that's not a part of your training regime, then when you're under the lights of the octagon and someone hits you, your body's going to go, oh, I'm not used to this. I'm going to react in a fight or flight mode. And they're not used to it. Therefore, it's going to affect their mental game and also their striking game or wrestling game, whatever it is. So, yeah, I think that is definitely a part of the training that needs to be implemented for any fighter, really.
Flight or fight, I mean, that's a great concept you just mentioned, because I think that can apply to Ronda Rousey in many ways. Her fall from grace, her rise was like no other. And yet her fall seems to have been so deep. I mean, she came into the Amanda Nunes fight in amazing shape. She never looked better. But once she got punched, that's when things got a little bit interesting, because her skill set was off. Your cognitive functions are not as they once were coming into the octagon. And, you know, could Amanda Nunes start that rise now? She's coming off 2 victories, Misha Tate and Ronda Rousey. I think they were both in the first round. So she's a devastating fighter in the bantamweight division. You're listening to SYN 90.7 FM, Above the Octagon. We just talked about Ronda Rousey previously, and it's time for a regular segment for each show, and it's called Remember That Fight. It's where I analyse fights previous, which were... they don't have to be amazing fights, but they could be, you know, they were politically motivated. There were a lot of, you know, inspirations behind that fight, a lot of bad blood. But the one I'm going to analyse was in London, and that was in last year, between Anderson, the greatest of all time, Silva, and Michael Bisping. Now, it's debatable now that Anderson Silva is the greatest of all time. Is he the greatest of all time? I don't believe so. You have John Jones, who is not competing in the octagon at the moment, but he's never lost a fight. His win-loss column suggests that he does have one loss, but guess what? He's never been beaten inside the octagon. That loss was a disqualification, and that disqualification shouldn't have came, because I believe he was not really given. He was given a warning, but it wasn't quite a well thought out rule. Punching someone at the back of the head. You don't want to do that. That's why they ruled it out. But John Jones was completely dominating that fight. Nevertheless, Anderson Silva has had 14 title defenses. He is a dominant fighter throughout the years. And Anderson Silva, in this fight against Michael Bisping, came off a drug suspension, a drug violation suspension, which shocked the UFC. Absolutely shocked mixed martial arts in general. Here is someone who is a great ambassador for the sport, gets caught with drugs. This is not an Anderson Silva problem. This was, I should say, a widespread problem where it wasn't just based on a select few. You know, the temptation to take steroids was high because the tests weren't around then to catch people. But now the UFC has really advanced their measures and has caught a lot of people, not just Anderson Silva. And in this fight, Bisping wanted to cement his spot as one of the perennial middleweight contenders vying for the belt. And one of the reasons why I've chosen this match is because this is what inspired Bisping to get the middleweight title now. He is the middleweight champion. Why? Because in round 3, he got caught with a knee, which completely threatened his dominance in rounds 1 and 2. He really was dominating Anderson Silva from a stand-up perspective, even though Anderson Silva is known as a stand-up wizard. And Bisping got caught with a huge knee in the 3rd round, but he kept on fighting. I mean, this is someone who has a heart of resilience. He keeps on fighting, no matter the blood that comes out, no matter how much pain he is in. He's got a banged up eye. I mean that literally. He can't see properly out of one eye, and yet he is still fighting inside the octagon. That's a testament to a man who just never gives up despite the hardships he is facing. And yet he is the middleweight champion. How good is that? But this is the fight that prompted him to win. If you saw Anderson Silva's knee, a mere mortal could not withstand that knee, especially when Anderson Silva is flying at you with that leverage, jumping off the canvas and hitting you with a ferocious knee. I mean, you're not going to get up, but Michael Bisping did, and Michael Bisping won. And that just shows huge perseverance. And to Anderson Silva's credit, he really showed resilience himself in this fight because he was getting dominated in rounds 1 and 2, but in the last 3 rounds, he really started to pick up. But the knee was contentious because Michael Bisping lost his mouth guard. Herb Dean, the referee, said, keep fighting, but Bisping was distracted, and then that's when he got caught with the knee. Anderson Silva did nothing wrong. The referee adjudicates the fight, and Anderson Silva took advantage of that. Herb Dean wasn't quite on the ball, and technically the rule is that you wait for a lull in the fight, a suspense, before you initiate a breakup. Otherwise, it ruins the flow of the fight. You know, everything's a push-pull game. You either pull out to go out of the fight and address another move you want to do towards your opponent, or you pull in. And you pull in with a punch, a kick, you know, a takedown, whatever. But so Bisping was pulling away, whereas Anderson Silva was pushing in. He was like, come at me, come get me. And Bisping was clearly not ready to fight. He wanted Herb Dean to break it up. But that just didn't happen. And this fight proved that mind over matter in fighting is almost everything. And that's undoubtable with Michael Bisping now being the middleweight champion of the world in the UFC. You're listening to SYN 90.7 FM above the Octagon. I'm Jonathan Pertile, taking you through the latest in mixed martial arts. And this is a huge fight in the works at the moment. Cody Garbrandt versus TJ Dillashaw in the UFC bantamweight division from the male side. So we're not talking about Amanda Nunes, though she could probably compete with most of the men in the division. But this is a huge rivalry. It's not an individual rivalry. It's a team rivalry. You have alpha male against TJ Dillashaw's team. And the thing here is that TJ left Team Alpha Male to go to another camp. And when you're in a training camp, it's almost like a brotherhood or a sisterhood. You come together and you trust in one another, similar to an AFL team or a basketball team, any team really, any team sport that has that element of brotherhood or sisterhood. And TJ left it. And so he's left the creed, and there's been a huge outpour because of it. Friends who used to be very close are no longer close, namely Uriah Faber, who's recently retired, a great bantamweight and featherweight fighter, and who controls the Team Alpha Male squad. He brought TJ Dillashaw up, and he showed him the path in many respects, and he became the bantamweight champion of the world. But now it's gone to Team Alpha Male. Cody Garbrandt, 25 years of age, one of the youngest UFC champions there has been. John Jones was younger by about 3 years, but Cody has a lot of talent, and his win-loss ratio suggests that. And he's only been knocked out once, Cody has. And Cody is a perennial boxer. He loves to box. He loves to trade within the octagon. And this is what it's about, entertaining the fans. And he's a crowd pleaser. But he doesn't just do that to entertain the crowd. That's his style of fighting. And those are the kind of fighters that the crowd warms to because you understand stand-up. You understand the origins of stand-up, even if it's very rudimentary. Muhammad Ali, everyone knows who Muhammad Ali is. He's a great boxer and in many ways has shaped the game of MMA from an entertainment perspective. Before Ali, who was the one who really stood up on the mic and would announce himself? We have Conor McGregor now, but I think Conor McGregor has been in the news too much, so I've decided to lean away from him a little bit. And Cody Garbrandt is one you'll be hearing about in the news for a long time to come. a decade, maybe even 2 decades. It's not unusual for fighters to fight in their 40s. They look after their body. It's they can fight for a while. Cody Garbrandt, before he beat Dominic Cruz is considered one of the, or if not the best bantamweight of all time in mixed martial arts. Cody Garbrandt had a recovery technique in training where he had a balloon put into his nose, which opened up his nostrils. So it gave him clean air after the training camp. And that's, a very unusual training method. But within the realms of what is legal, we were talking about performance-enhancing drugs before. Within the realms of what is legal, that is something I'm guessing that most fighters don't do. Obviously, he had an expert to help him. And oxygen is such a vital thing, not just in life, but especially in fighting. Just because there's 3-5 rounds compared to boxing's 12 rounds, doesn't mean these guys aren't tired. You often see in the second round they're, very tired. And if they get a lot of damage in the first round, they're, exhausted. So unless they have a really good, cardiovascular endurance, they won't survive. So TJ has a broken rank from Team Alpha Male, and he wants to win back the Bantamweight Championship again. And he's definitely capable, coming off a win against John Lineker. And TJ is a dangerous opponent because he not just boasts good stand-up, but he boasts great wrestling. He has a great all-round game. And Cody would be aware of this, having trained with him, having fought with him all the time when he was with Team Alpha Male. And TJ will know Cody's strengths. Cody will know TJ's strengths. And it will be up to who can adapt the most in the fight. You have your plan A, your plan B, not necessarily your plan C, but you problem solve in the octagon. And that's where the best fighters come to the fore. The people who can adapt on the fly. Because if you can't adapt and your opponent shows you a new move, submission move, a guillotine, a triangle choke, an armbar, a takedown, a single leg, a double leg, a clinch, you need to know how to defend those, whether that's with underhooks, single hooks, double hooks. You have to find ways to navigate difficult situations because you're never not going to get a difficult situation. It's not like Floyd Mayweather where you're a master of one. You need to be a master of at least 2 or 3 in mixed martial arts out of 7. That's just putting a cap on it. There's obviously more. And you have to be, in some rudimentary form, a jack of all trades. You just can't not be that. Otherwise, you're going to get beaten up. And Cody has more strengths than TJ, but TJ is more well-rounded. So this will come down to who can adapt within the octagon. You're listening to SYN 90.7 Above the Octagon. And our final topic for today is going to be the rematch made for UFC 210. Daniel Cormier versus Anthony Johnson for the light heavyweight title. Previously, Cormier submitted Johnson via rear naked choke at UFC 187 back in 2015, whilst Anthony Johnson destroyed Glover Teixeira, an intimidating opponent both on the ground and when standing up, has very solid jiu-jitsu skills, via knockout at UFC 202. He is one scary guy who boasts an incredibly powerful stand-up game. And Daniel Cormier is going to use his Olympic credentialed wrestling to try and combat Johnson's stand-up game. And if you saw in the first fight, Cormier got rocked in the first round. He got wobbled severely, but still withstood the pressure, leaned his body weight onto Anthony Johnson, tied him out in the clinches, and eventually submitted him. So Johnson will be working on his wrestling, trying to defend takedowns. And if he does that, there's no way Cormier can beat him because he's just too good standing up. Anthony Johnson is someone who started off almost in the middleweight division and cut an extreme amount of weight to go down to the middleweight division, which is 185 pounds. but now he has gone up to light heavyweight, more kind of his natural body weight, and he looks extremely strong in the Octagon. And it's always a calculation, not just for Johnson or Cormier, which division you're most suited in. Because there's a bit of a size difference between Cormier and Johnson, but Cormier, who's the smaller one, finds it harder to make the weight. So it's not about how tall you are, it's about your body type. And this is what gets to me a little bit sometimes, is people don't understand that height has nothing to do with weight. It's your body type. And there's such a big difference, because you have guys who are 5'10", 5'11", Mark Hunt in the heavyweight division, and he, weighs well over 265 pounds when he's not fighting. And that's not to say he's, unhealthy. That's just his natural body weight. And Cormier is a bit similar. When he versed Anderson Silva, he really had to cut down. You could see he was dehydrated. But this is not about a weight cut. This is about the technicalities of the fight. Will Cormier use his wrestling to stifle Johnson's amazing stand-up power? Or will Johnson just get a punch in very quickly and just change the course of the fight? Similar to what Jack, the executive producer of Get Serial, and I were talking about with Ronda Rousey. You get punched, it's a different story. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening into the second show of Above the Octagon on SYN 90.7.